I am going to be talking today briefly about my project called West, a Translation. I was commissioned by the Spike 150 Commission to write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. And so I spent a year, I was commissioned starting last year, so I spent a year reading as much as I could about the Transcontinental, visiting different sites. Chris was lovely enough to take me on what they call the dead Transcontinental route. I don't know what this is. And so I was trying to figure out exactly how to create a poem that could contain as much, if not all, of the information that I found. And what I did was I created a sort of translation. I'm not going to go too much into it because it will be explained when the PowerPoint sort of drops and I get to start performing it, because I start in on that. Oop, it's already starting. Thanks. It comes with some sound. It comes with a lot of images that are kind of culled from different aspects of the Transcontinental and the railroad's cultural impact on America. One of the things I was interested in thinking about was obviously the workers' experience. My own background is I'm half Chinese, half Norwegian. None of my family had historically worked on the railroad, but I was very interested in, of course, the Chinese contribution to the railroad. And so I do start from a sort of very specifically Chinese-American lens, but then I start moving outwards and I try to contain as many different voices and perspectives about the train as I possibly can. That's this, okay. The book itself that I'm still writing is massive, so you're only going to be getting, and the full performance is more like 30 minutes. But you're going to get a minor sample of what the full performance would look like, give you an idea of how it goes. But I think of translation as both a literal and a figurative act as a poet. How is it that poetry is trying to translate history into different types of documents? How is it that we translate the past into the present? And then also there is a very literal translation that occurs, which you'll see that happens. I don't read the Chinese titles, but I do read the English titles.
Hastui dot at benanlnida.
聽到火車嘅聲音， Δεν είμαστε επιβάτες στο τρένο εμείς. Το τρένο είναι επιβάτης που καβαλάει εμάς.
This is the sound of a train.
No podemos contar a todos los
Noi non prendiamo il
treno.
This is the sound of a train.
No viajamos en el tren. Él
Αυτός
viaja
είναι ο
sobre
ήχος
nosotros.
ενός
We do
τρένου.
not ride on the railroad.
Non
The
riusciamo
railroad rides on us.
噩耗傳聞實可哀，吊君何日果思回？無能冥目憑誰訴？有失應知悔此來。千古含愁千古恨，思鄉空對望鄉台。未酬壯志迷壤土，知以雄心死不悔。
Sorrowful news. Sorrowful news, sings the telegram, and Lincoln's body slides from D.C. to Springfield, his infant son, Willie, boxed beside him. Buffalo, Cleveland, Painesville, Ashtabula, 2 coffins, 1,700 miles, 14 days on 14 railroads. One day, a great line will unite us, the president promised. Father and son displayed capital after capital, Louisville, New Albany, Baltimore, Chicago, the black trains beach upon a tide of roses. Can you believe still in the promise of this union? I saw, General Dodge wrote, a little Negro drop on his knees and offer prayers, while above the dark news thrums on wires, gone, 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 across poles tall as the ones from which the president once ordered 38 Sioux to be hung. Pass. Brigham Young hoped passing trades would enliven trade, while Congress hoped trade would pass polygamy from existence. Stanford didn't think the Chinese could pass muster, then used them to pass up the Irish, after which he wanted Chinese out, passed over by law to keep them from passing for white. The work passed to Japanese, who were put in camps, then on to Mexicans, Navajo, Italians, Poles, Greeks, Swedes. Each man passed into and out of some approximation of American. We cannot help but be benefited by it, wrote Brigham Young. A bond paid down per mile of track, Congress had to pass an act to make the buildings stop. It's in the past, but once these barons didn't plan to meet. They planned to win. Each side built right on past each other. Body. A carload passed last night, their bones returned in barrels marked pickles. Thick as bees, ants, locusts, celestials lay siege to nature in her strongest citadel. Their genius is imitation. Show them once to do a thing and their education is complete. Wherever you put them, you'll find them good. They can withstand freezing, hunger, thirst, and heat. Their simple, narrow, but not dull minds running in old grooves. Congealed quantities, crystals of social substance. Unicated as boys or sodomites, they breed defunct in the heat of germs. They can be shipped to shore in great quantities. Even their clothes come, identical, studded with rivets. Have knowledge. Immigration questionnaire given to Chinese claiming to be former U.S. residents or for Chinese entering the country during the Chinese Exclusion Act. Have you ridden in a streetcar? Can you describe the taste of bread? Where are the Joss houses located in the city? Do Jackson Street and DuPont run in a circle or a line? What is the fruit your mother ate before she bore you? How many letters a year do you receive from your father? Of which material is your ancestral hall now built? How many water buffalo does your uncle own? Do you love him? Do you hate her? What kind of birds sang at your parents' wedding? What are the birth dates for each of your cousins? Did your brother die from starvation, work, or murder? Do you know the price of tea? Have you ever touched a stranger's face as he slept? Did it snow the year you first wintered in the desert? How much weight is a bucket and a hammer? Which store is opposite your grandmother's? Did you sleep with that man for money? Did you sleep with that man for love? Name the color and number of all your mother's dresses, now your village's rivers. What diseases of the heart do you carry? What country do you see when you think of your children? Does your sister ever write? In which direction does her front door face? How many steps did you take when you finally left her? And how far did you walk before you looked back?
This is the sound of a train.
This is a sound of a train.
This is a sound of a train.
This is a sound of a train.
This is the sound
This
of a train.
is the sound of a
This is a
train.
sound
This
of a
is a
train.
sound of a
This
train.
is a sound
This
of
is
a
the
train.
sound of a
This
train.
is
This
the
is a
sound
sound
of
This
a
is a
train.
sound of a train.
This is a sound of a train.
This is the sound of a train.
This is the sound
This
of
is
a
a
train.
This is a sound of a
This
train.
is the sound
This is the sound
This
of a
is a
train.
sound of a
This is the
train. This is a
sound of a
sound of a
train.
train.
Journey, Robert Smithson on A.J. Russell's photo of the Transcontinental. This excessiveness of men spilling, crowding to mark their X of time and money, I find lamentable. The little moment composed of paper and light, alienated spike, relic, in the hands of those willing themselves be relics too. Nothing so linear as human ego and desire, while the past turns and returns, spirals, like these pelicans journeying over the red waters off Roselle, streams of purple, sodium, yucca rhymed with pustules of dust. Each one lifts, rises, finds what only some parts of the cells remembers, nests in the wreck of what we've left, this bulk of ruined train, its wheel wells turned the rust of flaking blood. Of course, they trekked the human bodies from the crash back out. We care for our own. We care nothing for our own, making our lives material so as to free us all better to forget. Who remembers the names behind that photo's grasping fingers? Who recalls the dead the UP ferried from its crash? The medals they left, not as memorial to them, but because it costs less to leave the evidence than drag it all back out. Antiquity. What am I searching for in this dead wreckage? Trestles of bone spar webbed with orb weavers? To thumb a slice of ginger bottle or scratch black up from burnt opium pipes? To call that body back and time and hold it as if object were owner? And is it honor or indifference to translate material into personhood? As if I could wring this song note by note out of a bird, isolate the dance from the dancer in this sepia photo of a Navajo performing himself for East Coast tourists who hang slack-jawed from train windows. I want to put that dancer back into the privacy of history, but he's got his own future. He's out there now, working on the railroad. Thousand. 1,000 spades to clear the cuts, 1,000 ropes to haul out redwoods, for the mountains 1,000 arms to scale the rock, 1,000 hands to lose in blasts, 1,000 corpses frozen in the snow. 1,000 bags of opium, oolong, rice mats, 1,000 and 1,000 and 1,000 added to each payroll, but not a single name. 1,000 shards of pottery haloing the trestle. Someone sketched a worker's face along the flip side of a telegram. He's $4 a day, $35 a month. His profile wreathes like smoke between the numbers. How many cairns did you say we passed outside Kelton? Translate these absences to bodies. Translate these bodies back to men. Hold sorrow. Imagine a farm, a famine. Your mother promised you'll learn tailoring. Imagine your father pocketing $600. Now here's the boat, its black planks wet with fog. Here is the room holding a bed, no mirror, your wash basin. You have one window wired to face the street. He will keep his pants on, his greasy shirt, his shoes. Imagine the quarter pressed after into your palm. Your street will be named for presidents you never heard of, the city's lights like strings of blood in puddles. Imagine, if you could, you'd carve your father's name on a knife tip. At night, only the train cries. Your door locks from the outside. Miss Home. Ways to die. Blasting accident, derailment, boiler crack. Crushed between trains crossing in the night. Electrocution, bad food, heart attack. You can work yourself to death, a la John, a la Henry, or you can stay at home and die anyway. Fist and noose, club, gun, knife in the back. Gossip, sharecropping, bottle of rum with gas-soaked rag. What is freedom but the power to choose where you won't die? What is a train but the self once yoked to terror loosed into a force that glides on heat and steam? You're so far from Mississippi, the UP boss said when we hit Rock Springs. Don't you miss your home? Miss home, I told him. I'm hoping to miss it entirely.
Well, they catch on here on a mountain, up on the mountain so high. Yeah, boy. Last words I heard that poor boy say, give me a cool drink of water before I die. Give me a cool drink of water before I die. Give me a cool drink of water before I die. Give me a cool drink of water before I die. Give me a cool drink of water before I die. Give me a cool drink of water before I die. Give me a cool drink of water before I die.
Soil. Letter from Brigham Young to General Dodge, Union Pacific, 1869. The locust's hum at first was like a line of flame. Then the air burst into reds, silver-edged and filled with mouths like snapping scissors. They ate our wheat, blacked out the skies until the falling bodies settled like a fog over Great Salt Lake, the carcasses brined to a black and growing wall. We thought the soil here was rich, but who knew how rare rich was, how terribly fragile, and how temperamental we become trying to sustain these plots, too alkaline to keep a crop alive. Nothing natural but made in the beauty of this place. To create a home, we imported trees and water. We slashed and burned to excavate a state where nothing lived, nothing ruled us. And yet in all this nothing, we were subject to the rules nothingness demanded and allowed, which requires every drop of blood from our bodies, all that we might plant and tend and love, that demands all might still be taken from us and fed to the abyss, not the faith on which I believe each soul is nourished. Nothing natural here but need. Our symbol, as you know, is the hive of bees, and yet in our strength of will, our number, perhaps our enemies, might picture us like the locust, which arrives in waves to feed without satiety, which visits more regularly than rain and covers the earth not out of spite, but because they will survive. Dear General, all this we have endured, and now you think we should not remind you of the debt we're owed. We, who lobbied for this railroad, who agreed to unite this nation with you and bring the riches of the East west to tame its wilds? Do you wonder at our anger and our exigence? General, We worked your grading to Monument Point. In thousands, drilled and blasted, rent the very foundations of the earth until these hills swarmed with our fresh encampments. We are patient, but we aren't fools. If we'd been a collection of mere individuals linked by money, long ago you'd have seen us crushed by weather, luck, and the Indian. Together, in faith, we have brought this place to heal. We can do more. Even the locusts, which once again have come to plague us, make little dent in our labors. Their dark trails that waver in the heat like iron bars are merely a mirage. Our kerchiefs dipped in camphor smell, not like sweat and earth, but sweet water. They do not stifle nor blind us to the promise of the money your company offered, a promise which is gone now too many months unanswered. We are hungry for an answer, sir. We wait for your reply. Each morning, your railroad tunnel shakes with the reports of our artillery. You can hear them if you listen. The mountains reverberate from base to summit, ringing back our volleys with thunderous echoes, as if in anger. Earth. From the 1862 Railroad Act, Section 2, an erasure. That the right of way through public lands granted to said company for the construction of railroads and telegraph, right, power, authority, hereby given to said company to take adjacent to the line, road, earth, stone, timber. Said right of way is granted to the extent the United States shall extinguish all lands falling and required for the said, with the welfare of the said, falling required for the said, Indians the said, grant herein made. Not ash. Not gone, but changed. Not a body erased or born a grief alone, but praise. This country made us grow each another's soul, not one for earth or heaven only, but nation, electric, dangerous as a third rail. We, the middle kingdom between white and its opposites, its thousand shades of fissure, our existence would compose into a fantasy of whole. Our bodies built more than a railroad. On my 1919 map, red, black, and yellow veins trace rails lengthwise across the states, the fragile paper splitting at its seams. Like any machine, we translate the magnitude of human force to change. We're history, not silent, not invisible, not a dream, not oil, they told me. The first trains ran on steam.
We cannot count all the dead.
This is the sound of a train.
Δεν είμαστε επιβάτες στο τρένο εμείς. Το τρένο είναι επιβάτες που καβαλάει εμάς.
This is the sound of a train.
This is the sound of a train.
This is the sound of a train.
We cannot count all the dead.
This is the sound of a train.
Αυτός είναι ο ήχος ενός
We do
τρένου.
not ride on the railroad. The railroad rides on us.
So that's it. Though that's actually not it. That's just like a tiny fraction of it. But that is basically the project in a very encapsulated nutshell. So I just let it open for questions if you have any. I can even read other poems that were not included and talk about those if you were curious. But happy to talk about anything. Yes?
I can't even imagine how you would approach the beginning of research for this. I mean, there's so much information that you've gathered. Mm-hmm. How long ago did you start this?
I started it a year ago, and it's up to 60 pages. Yeah, so I've got about 60, completed that I feel okay with, about 40 individual poems. But what I imagine will happen is I'd like to turn it into a book, which is that you would have, you'll lose the sonic stuff, unfortunately, but I can have maps, I can have some photos that stand against the poems in some interesting ways, and that way you can get I'd start with the Chinese poem, and then I would end with the translation. So you would still get that sense of the project itself. I've also played with the idea of a website where you would go to the Chinese poem and you could click on each individual character or set of characters. It would open to the poem itself along with some facts. The thing about the book that's really useful, or a website, is that I can also include some of the factual detail as well as the citations of where I got some of this language, which would be useful, I think, for people pedagogically. But yeah, no, I've got a 3-page bibliography. I read and saw as many things as I could possibly encapsulate, and one book one article would lead to another, and sometimes there were surprising things. Like the stuff on Robert Smithson was very surprising to me, because the argument that some art historians have made is that Smithson deliberately chose that site because of promontory and the idea of that X marks the spot, that idea of time is this thing that is linear and it can be defined, whereas his argument is that actually time spirals. And that's sort of an argument I make in the poem too, the sort of reverberations of some of this language from the 19th century I find very contemporary, especially around the language around immigration and the Chinese. Any other questions? Yes?
I was here when you presented the evening of the Governor's Award, and I would agree the multimedia, and so the words are just extraordinary of themselves.
Thank you.
And deserve to be read anyway. But the multimedia part of it just really adds a dimension of meaning and layers of understanding and
thank you.
And commentary.
Yeah, thank you. I thought a lot about the different images, and some of them are, because the thing about text and image, when you put them together, they create a third meaning, right? And so when you just listen to the words, you do get one story, but when you see some of those other images layered on top of it, suddenly you're making other kinds of connections that you might not get to make just through the language itself. And the same thing just with looking at photographs, that you think you're looking at a very specific moment in time, and the language actually allows you, ideally, to move to another place in time, another kind of narrative. And so, I'm glad that you like that, because it's one of the things that I also like about that multimedia, or that combination of text and image. So even if it's a published, book, I definitely still want to have some images in there to have that kind of talking back. Yeah. Yes?
Clearly you sorted through piles of
stuff.
Information what sort of images, ideas, attitudes helped you clarify what to bring into the poetry and what to leave out?
That's a really good question, because to a certain extent that is an instinctual thing, that you come across something and you're like, that will be important, or that can be useful. The one thing I automatically discarded was anything specifically about what we consider the central players, right? So I don't write from Dodge's point of view necessarily. I don't write from Stanford's point of view, though. I'm going back and forth. I still have an opportunity to do something like that. And the reason I don't do that is I feel like so much of history has been involved with the central players. I'm also, depending on the kind of train geek that I'm, is reading the poem, there's not a lot about the actual construction in terms of some of the nitty-gritty details. And I think it's because I'm more interested in trying to see cross cultural narratives, similarities, ways in which different types of workers that didn't see themselves as aligned were actually treated quite similarly. Like, I thought it was very interesting that the Mormons were stiffed in pay, just in the ways that the Chinese were stiffed in pay too. And that, so I think that that's a nice kind of little resonance. And I think what's been fascinating to me in doing some of the research is to find out that, and not as a historian, certainly not as a historian of the 19th century American West, that the Mormon and Indian question were considered one and the same. And so some of the really fascinating ways in which, like the ghost dance, for instance, might have actually been influenced by a kind of Mormon culture and theology too, and cross-cultural exchange around that. So there's all of these, that's the kind of stuff that was really interesting to me, these bits and details in which we tend to think of specific histories for specific groups, but actually they meet and they merge in really, really weird ways. But I also was really attracted to language that was thinking about human bodies as automatons. I teach Asian American literature, and that's actually a very consistent theme in science fiction that's written by Asian American writers. And you can see where it comes from. You can see that the 19th century, the ways that they wrote about some of these workers' bodies dehumanized them at the source, much in the same ways that they would write about African American workers' bodies as these perfect machines that could endure something that no white person could possibly endure. And the Chinese can withstand freezing, hunger, thirst, heat, like this idea that they are beyond any sort of human sentiment and emotion. I found that really interesting. And so in that case, I just looked for language that itself did that work. And I can claim to have written the poem, but really I just took the language from Frederick Jackson Turner's The Significance of the American Frontier, The Frontier in American History. And I just, took his language and strung it together, and his argument about what the frontier is and what it means. There's one line, I just have to read it to you because I just loved it so much, if I can find it. But he basically is talking about our fascination with individual freedom and liberty. Oh, it's up here. Yeah, this is not me, though it was so good. I wish it was me. He says, the settler will not settle his desires, and so the soul of our country stays restless, nervous, intolerant of administrative experience and education, hews to the press of liberty which knows no bounds, gives few benefits, risks government laxity and a spoils system. I read that and I was like, well, I'm just going to take that. That's just too good. That's what I'm talking about, where like there's a really interesting kind of parallel between what people in the late 19th century are thinking about and what we're thinking about today. And that's what, again, I wanted to highlight, that it's a contemporary story as much as it's a historical story. Any other questions? Yes?
Have you reflected on the role that your own ethnic background might have played in the creative enterprise?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I went back and forth in this. So it's one of the first drafts. There's a lot of these poems, the short ones, are sonnets, and that's because that's the closest to what this is technically called is regulated verse. So it's the closest approximation in our language to the Chinese verse. So there's some sonnets that I wrote that really do reflect upon my experience, but increasingly I'm less attracted to that. In fact, I want to take myself entirely out of the equation in terms of my obvious personal history. I think anyone knowing my biography would say, well, that's why she's got such an interest in the Chinese. And it is, in fact, why I have such an interest in the Chinese. But I don't want it to just be about the Chinese workers' experience, because I think, again, there's a lot of inter-community kinds of issues that, and there's a book that just came out from the University of California Press talking about Chinese and indigenous workers and Chinese and indigenous experiences around railroads in general and across the globe. And when you read this book, you're like, wow, that, this is a colonial story that gets reproduced over and over and over and over and over again. And we think of the Transcontinental as this entirely individual, specific, very American achievement. But in fact, if we think of the railroad's completion as a colonial project, it in fact duplicates and almost exact and mimics so many other railroad projects, like in India, for example, in Africa, with so many of the exact same effects. So, this is a really all my answers are super long to questions, so I apologize. But I want my own background to be a sort of introduction, but certainly not the end point at all. And so I think I am going to just take myself out and my family history out. You had a question too?
Yeah, you mentioned you've got 60 pages, some in draft, some in there. What does done look like?
Exhaustion is what it looks like. Yeah.
Is there an end of the narrative, an end of the poem cycle?
Well, it turns out, I mean, the great thing is because it is a translation, there is an endpoint because there's only so many characters or groupings of characters. So that becomes the endpoint. But the difficulty is, am I satisfied with the individual translation of that particular set of characters? So sometimes I have gone back and said, that's just weak, and thrown that out, and then come across something else and am rewriting. There's, you know, and done to me is going to be when I feel like I've got, I don't know what, that's a great question. I don't know. I think probably exhaustion at this point. But, you know, I'm working on a couple of poems right now that are still, one is called Face. One of the things that I found really fascinating about this was the way that war really works in the Transcontinental's history, the Civil War, but then also the idea of a future war. You know, one of the things that they thought immediately about the Transcontinental is we can get arms across the states really fast. And of course, lots of Civil War soldiers had been hired, ex-veterans had been hired, especially on the UP's line, to protect against, you know, attacks by different native tribes. And so, and A.J. Russell was actually himself a war photographer, and I know all of my, you just get me started, I'll just go and go and go. But one of the things I found really fascinating was the ways in which Civil War photography around the war dead might have influenced the ways in which Russell himself decided to frame the trains. If you look at, I don't know if you guys know anything about stereoscopes, but these old Civil War photographs would, they would make these stereoscopes of dead soldiers, and the ways in which Russell would frame these dead soldiers up close against these different architectural things in order for the human to give a sort of scale to the architecture of it. That gets replicated in the ways that he photographs the Transcontinental. So I'm doing a poem, a longer poem called Face. It's all about thinking about photographic representations of war and how that actually influences the way we might have seen and visually represented the Transcontinental down the line. So I've got another one called Tell, which is the UP hired editors and journalists to take rides on the train in order to sort of drum up public interest, more money. And part of that experience was hiring Pawnee to pretend to attack trains so they could have a sort of authentic Western experience. At the same time, they were like they would say, don't tell all the stories that are actually out here, because workers were getting killed in some of these raids. They were fighting. And so the UP wanted to ride this very specific line between the West, it's fun, it's exciting, you'll see natives and doing native things. At the same time, they were like, it can't be so fun and exciting that you're going to die. So this really interesting, issue of public relations. So that's also coming too. Anyway, yes?
I know you already talked about how hard it is to put an ending to this, but is there some point in time where you will say, I'm going to talk about the builders, and but I'm not going to talk about the passengers and the freight and everything that flows out of after it's built?
Oh, that is such a good question. I am actually writing about that. One of the other poems I've written, it's actually Death. I talked to a guy who rides the trains illegally now. And this is another kind of interesting story of both capitalism and war. He is obsessed with charting the products that get taken along the Transcontinental. And he told me stories about, like, there are special cars and you can identify them for, I don't know how, but there are people who ride these trains even now because they're trying to get into these special cars to sit in these really fancy cars that are being shipped across the country. And they're sort of like bird watchers. They're just like checking on, like I rode a Tesla, I rode a Jaguar, but they did it in the train. And and he also talks about, like, a lot of the people who are riding illegally now are veterans of war. They're coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and for them, I was like, why do you think this is? Because he says, there's no reason, like before, there were a lot of people riding the train for free. And again, I'm sorry, I just have so many facts and we're just going to dump them all on you. I mean, some of them were the Paiute and the Pawnee, that they were given these sort of free rides because they were friendly to the railroad. But a lot of them were hobos, as they call them, right? People looking for work during the Great Migration and the Dust Bowl and all that sort of stuff. But now there's no reason to try to hop a train illegally, but except for something that may be psychologically itching or disturbing you. And so he's saying that, he was talking about like all of these basically traumatized veterans of war who are now sort of riding these trains and because they think it sounds like war. That's what that one guy described. So I do talk about that kind of passenger experience. I also talk about the ways in which there's one that I didn't read called Regret. It's in the voice of Anthony Trollope, who came and did a tour of the trains, not the Transcontinental, but just the railroad in general, like around America in 1862. And he's also writing about the Civil War, but he's talking specifically about women in public transportation. And he's horrified by these women and the way that American women behave on trains and the way that they sort of demand all this chivalry and stuff like that. And it is interesting to think about the way that the train even shapes ideas of what a woman is, how a woman is supposed to behave in public, because the train is this space now that women can travel by themselves long distances. There's a whole series of etiquette books for young women traveling on trains now, like that show up around the Transcontinental, because you can get raped on trains, you can get all your money taken from you on trains, and so and men, how are you supposed to behave? And one of the things I also found fascinating was the ways in which race and gender worked when the Transcontinental or when railroads sort of pick up, which is that African-American women were very canny. They understood that white women had demanded private trains for their own security. And it wasn't based on race at that time, it was just based on gender. So African-American women were like, we're women. And so they got on those trains, and then they were in this desegregated space. And then, of course, the Jim Crow laws take effect, and everyone's like, well, get them out. They're not, are they, what trumps? Is it race or is it gender? And it's the train, actually, that starts to make these kinds of conversations really animated. So yes, I am writing about all that, too. So that's, I'll never be finished. I am never going to be finished. One last question, and then I'll stop, because I'm sure this is just too many facts for everybody to... Yes?
So your choice of the form of the sonnet is interesting to me, not just because of its relationship to the original Chinese, but because of one of the greatest literary creations in English was Shakespeare's sonnet cycle.
Yeah.
And how that introduces a whole bunch of like ambiguity and complexity and layers of meaning and things that are not said and things that are said and all the things. I mean, it's kind of the edge of the literary form. And so the sonnet is one of the most like formal literary expressions, but then you're packing in all of this complexity to it as well. I mean,
why the sonnet, or how am I approaching it? Yeah.
Like maybe just a little bit beyond the relationship to the Chinese verse.
This is another great question, and this is, if any of you actually do write poetry, this is a really poetry geek kind of answer, which is, sonnets have a way of thinking, and it's because the rhyme scheme breaks, and especially a Shakespearean sonnet will break up essentially into 3 quatrains and a couplet, and the couplet is meant, which means you're really supposed to have one turn right before that couplet sort of wraps things up. But in a way, you actually have 3 different what we call voltas or turns, each time the quatrain changes, and a quatrain is organized by its rhyme scheme. And so sonnets are very involved in a kind of rhetorical argument by their very structure. And so to a certain extent, they can lend themselves to a project that, like this, could be a bit didactic, which is that you are making an argument, you're proposing one argument, you're reversing it slightly or embellishing it in the next quatrain, you're looking at another kind of conclusion to that argument, and then you're wrapping it up. I will say, one of the things, and this is just a private thing for me, the regulated verse that was written here, it may sound very formal because you can hear the rhymes in the Cantonese, but in fact it's not terribly well done. And so what I've tried to do is create an idea of sonnetness that does not actually play by the rules of the sonnet in order to sort of keep with the rough-hewn quality of the original, to sort of speak to that a bit. So my sonnets in this case I would not say are very good, and that was also a sort of deliberate choice. But in terms of thinking about one last thing about the train and the sonnet. Sonnets usually tend to be very obsessed with time, the passage of time, mortality. And one of the things that the train also did was it sort of made us all think about time, like how to try, especially to make sure that two trains didn't like hit each other in the night. So you had to actually like think about like when one train leaves and when another train leaves and that sort of stuff. And so that was also kind of in my mind. Anyway, thank you guys so much. And that's it.